The Haunted House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. The Mortals in the House. Under none of the accredited ghostly circumstances, and environed by none of the conventional ghostly surroundings, did I first make acquaintance with the house, which is the subject of this Christmas piece. I saw it in the daylight, with the sun upon it. There was no wind, no rain, no lightning, no thunder, no awful or unwonted circumstance of any kind to heighten its effect. More than that, I had come to it direct from a railway station. It was not more than a mile distant from the railway station, and as I stood outside the house, looking back upon the way I had come, I could see the goods train running smoothly along the embankment in the valley. I will not say that everything was utterly commonplace, because I doubt if anything can be that, except to utterly commonplace people. And there, my vanity steps in. But I will take it on myself to say that anybody might see the house as I saw it, any fine autumn morning. The manner of my lighting on it was this. I was travelling towards London out of the north, intending to stop by the way to look at the house. My health required a temporary residence in the country, and a friend of mine who knew that, and who had happened to drive past the house, had written to me to suggest it as a likely place. I had got into the train at midnight, and had fallen asleep, and had woke up and had sat looking out of window at the brilliant northern lights in the sky, and had fallen asleep again, and had woke up again to find the night gone, with the usual discontented conviction on me that I hadn't been to sleep at all. Upon which question, in the first imbecility of that condition, I am ashamed to believe that I would have done wager by battle with the man who sat opposite me. That opposite man had had, through the night, as that opposite man always has, several legs too many, and all of them too long. In addition to this unreasonable conduct, which was only to be expected of him, he had had a pencil and a pocket-book, and had been perpetually listening and taking notes. It had appeared to me that these aggravating notes related to the jolts and bumps of the carriage, and I should have resigned myself to his taking them, under a general supposition that he was in the civil engineering way of life, if he had not sat staring straight over my head whenever he listened. He was a goggle-eyed gentleman of a perplexed aspect, and his demeanour became unbearable. It was a cold, dead morning, the sun not being up yet, and when I had outwatched the paling light of the fires of the iron country, and the curtain of heavy smoke that hung at once between me and the stars, and between me and the day, I turned to my fellow traveller and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but do you observe anything particular in me?" For really, he appeared to be taking down either my travelling cap or my hair with a minuteness that was a liberty. The goggle-eyed gentleman withdrew his eyes from behind me, as if the back of the carriage were 100 miles off, and said, with a lofty look of compassion for my insignificance, "In you, sir." "B." "B, sir," said I, growing warm. "I have nothing to do with you, sir," returned the gentleman. "Pray, let me listen." "Oh." He enunciated this vowel after a pause, and noted it down. At first I was alarmed, for an express lunatic and no communication with the guard is a serious position. The thought came to my relief that the gentleman might be what is properly called a rapper, one of a sect for some of whom I have the highest respect, but whom I don't believe in. I was going to ask him the question when he took the bread out of my mouth. "You will excuse me," said the gentleman contemptuously, "if I am too much in advance of common humanity to trouble myself at all about it. I have passed the night, as indeed I pass the whole of my time now, in spiritual intercourse." "Oh," said I, somewhat snappishly. "The conferences of the night began," continued the gentleman, turning several leaves of his notebook, "with this message: evil communications corrupt good manners." "Sound," said I, "but absolutely new?" "New from spirit," returned the gentleman. I could only repeat my rather snappish "Oh," and asked if I might be favored with the last communication. "A bird in the hand," said the gentleman, reading his last entry with great solemnity, "is worth two in the bush." "Truly I am of the same opinion," said I, "but shouldn't it be bush?" "It came to me bosh," returned the gentleman. The gentleman then informed me that the spirit of Socrates had delivered this special revelation in the course of the night. "My friend, I hope you are pretty well. There are two in this railway carriage. How do you do? There are 17,479 spirits here, but you cannot see them. Pythagoras is here. He is not at liberty to mention it, but hopes you like traveling." Galileo likewise had dropped in with this scientific intelligence. "I am glad to see you, amico. Come sta? Water will freeze when it is cold enough. Addio." In the course of the night also, the following phenomena had occurred. Bishop Butler had insisted on spelling his name Bubbler, for which offence against orthography and good manners he had been dismissed as out of temper. John Milton, suspected of wilful mystification, had repudiated the authorship of Paradise Lost, and had introduced, as joint authors of that poem, two unknown gentlemen, respectively named Grungers and Skagington. And Prince Arthur, nephew of King John of England, had described himself as tolerably comfortable in the seventh circle, where he was learning to paint on velvet under the direction of Mrs. Trimmer and Mary Queen of Scots. If this should meet the eye of the gentleman who favoured me with these disclosures, I trust he will excuse my confessing that the sight of the rising sun and the contemplation of the magnificent order of the vast universe made me impatient of them. In a word, I was so impatient of them that I was mightily glad to get out at the next station, and to exchange these clouds and vapours for the free air of heaven. By that time it was a beautiful morning. As I walked away among such leaves as had already fallen from the golden, brown, and russet trees, and as I looked around me on the wonders of creation and thought of the steady, unchanging, and harmonious laws by which they are sustained, the gentleman's spiritual intercourse seemed to me as poor a piece of journey work as ever this world saw, in which heathen state of mind I came within view of the house, and stopped to examine it attentively. It was a solitary house, standing in a sadly neglected garden, a pretty even square of some 2 acres. It was a house of about the time of George II, as stiff, as cold, as formal, and in as bad taste as could possibly be desired by the most loyal admirer of the whole quartet of Georges. It was uninhabited, but had, within a year or two, been cheaply repaired to render it habitable. I say cheaply, because the work had been done in a surface manner, and was already decaying as to the paint and plaster, though the colours were fresh. A lopsided board drooped over the garden wall, announcing that it was to let on very reasonable terms, well furnished. It was much too closely and heavily shadowed by trees, and in particular there were 6 tall poplars before the front windows, which were excessively melancholy, and the site of which had been extremely ill chosen. It was easy to see that it was an avoided house, a house that was shunned by the village, to which my eye was guided by a church spire some half a mile off, a house that nobody would take, and the natural inference was that it had the reputation of being a haunted house. No period within the 24 hours of day and night is so solemn to me as the early morning. In the summertime, I often rise very early and repair to my room to do a day's work before breakfast, and I am always on those occasions deeply impressed by the stillness and solitude around me. Besides that, there is something awful in the being surrounded by familiar faces asleep, in the knowledge that those who are dearest to us and to whom we are dearest are profoundly unconscious of us, in an impassive state, anticipative of that mysterious condition to which we are all tending, the stopped life, the broken threads of yesterday, the deserted seat, the closed book, the unfinished but abandoned occupation, all are images of death. The tranquillity of the hour is the tranquillity of death. The color and the chill have the same association. Even a certain air that familiar household objects take upon them when they first emerge from the shadows of the night into the morning, of being newer, and as they used to be long ago, has its counterpart in the subsidence of the worn face of maturity or age in death into the old youthful look. Moreover, I once saw the apparition of my father at this hour. He was alive and well, and nothing ever came of it, but I saw him in the daylight, sitting with his back towards me, on a seat that stood beside my bed. His head was resting on his hand, and whether he was slumbering or grieving I could not discern. Amazed to see him there, I sat up, moved my position, leaned out of bed, and watched him. As he did not move, I spoke to him more than once. As he did not move then, I became alarmed and laid my hand upon his shoulder, as I thought, and there was no such thing. For all these reasons, and for others less easily and briefly stateable, I find the early morning to be my most ghostly time. Any house would be more or less haunted to me in the early morning, and a haunted house could scarcely address me to greater advantage than then. I walked on into the village, with the desertion of this house upon my mind, and I found the landlord of the little inn sanding his doorstep. I bespoke breakfast, and broached the subject of the house. "Is it haunted?" I asked. The landlord looked at me, shook his head, and answered, "I say nothing." "Then it is haunted." "Well," cried the landlord in an outburst of frankness that had the appearance of desperation, "I wouldn't sleep in it." "Why not?" "If I wanted to have all the bells in a house ring with nobody to ring 'em, and all the doors in a house bang with nobody to bang 'em, and all sorts of feet treading about with no feet there, why then," said the landlord, I'd sleep in that house. Is anything seen there? The landlord looked at me again, and then, with his former appearance of desperation, called down his stable yard for Ikey. The call produced a high-shouldered young fellow with a round red face, a short crop of sandy hair, a very broad humorous mouth, a turned-up nose, and a great sleeved waistcoat of purple bars with mother-of-pearl buttons that seemed to be growing upon him, and to be in a fair way, if it were not pruned, of covering his head and overrunning his boots. "This gentleman wants to know," said the landlord, "if anything's seen at the Poplars." "Hooded woman with a howl," said Ikey, in a state of great freshness. "Do you mean a cry?" "I mean a bird, sir." "A hooded woman with an owl. Dear me. Did you ever see her?" "I seen the howl." "Never the woman?" "Not so plain as the howl, but they always keeps together." "Has anybody ever seen the woman as plainly as the owl?" "Lord bless you, sir, lots." "Who?" "Lord bless you, sir, lots." "The general dealer opposite, for instance, who is opening his shop?" "Perkins? Bless you, Perkins wouldn't go a nigh the place. No," observed the young man with considerable feeling. "He ain't overwise, ain't Perkins, but he ain't such a fool as that." Here, the landlord murmured his confidence in Perkins's knowing better. "Who is, or who was, the hooded woman with the owl? Do you know?" "Well," said Ikey, holding up his cap with one hand while he scratched his head with the other, "they say in general that she was murdered, and the howl he yelted the while." This very concise summary of the facts was all I could learn, except that a young man, as hearty and likely a young man as ever I see, had been took with fits and held down in 'em after seeing the hooded woman. Also that a personage, dimly described as a "hald chap, a sort of one-eyed tramp, answering to the name of Joby, unless you challenged him as Greenwood, and then he said, 'Why not? And even if so, mind your own business,' had encountered the hooded woman a matter of 5 or 6 times. But I was not materially assisted by these witnesses, inasmuch as the first was in California, and the last was, as Ikey said, and he was confirmed by the landlord, anywheres. Now, although I regard with a hushed and solemn fear the mysteries between which and this state of existence is interposed the barrier of the great trial and change that fall on all the things that live, and although I have not the audacity to pretend that I know anything of them, I can no more reconcile the mere banging of doors, ringing of bells, creaking of boards, and such like insignificances, with the majestic beauty and pervading analogy of all the divine rules that I am permitted to understand, than I had been able a little while before to yoke the spiritual intercourse of my fellow traveller to the chariot of the rising sun. Moreover, I had lived in 2 haunted houses, both abroad. In one of these, an old Italian place, which bore the reputation of being very badly haunted indeed, and which had recently been twice abandoned on that account, I lived 8 months, most tranquilly and pleasantly, notwithstanding that the house had a score of mysterious bedrooms which were never used, and possessed in one large room in which I sat reading, times out of number at all hours, and next to which I slept, a haunted chamber of the first pretensions. I gently hinted these considerations to the landlord, and as to this particular house having a bad name, I reasoned with him. Why, how many things had bad names undeservedly, and how easy it was to give bad names. And did he not think that if he and I were persistently to whisper in the village that any weird-looking, old drunken tinker of the neighborhood had sold himself to the devil, he would come in time to be suspected of that commercial venture? All this wise talk was perfectly ineffective with the landlord, I am bound to confess, and was as dead a failure as ever I made in my life. To cut this part of the story short, I was piqued about the haunted house, and was already half resolved to take it. So after breakfast, I got the keys from Perkins's brother-in-law, a whip and harness maker who keeps the post office, and is under submission to a most rigorous wife of the doubly succeeding little Emmanuel persuasion, and went up to the house, attended by my landlord and by Ike. Within, I found it, as I had expected, transcendently dismal. The slowly changing shadows waved on it from the heavy trees were doleful in the last degree. The house was ill-placed, ill-built, ill-planned, and ill-fitted. It was damp. It was not free from dry rot. There was a flavor of rats in it, and it was the gloomy victim of that indescribable decay which settles on all the work of man's hands whenever it's not turned to man's account. The kitchens and offices were too large and too remote from each other. Above stairs and below, waste tracts of passage intervened between patches of fertility represented by rooms, and there was a mouldy old well with a green growth upon it, hiding like a murderous trap near the bottom of the back stairs, under the double row of bells. One of these bells was labelled, on a black ground in faded white letters, Master B. This, they told me, was the bell that rang the most. Who was Master B? I asked. Is it known what he did while the owl hooted? Rang the bell, said Ike. I was rather struck by the prompt dexterity with which this young man pitched his fur cap at the bell and rang it himself. It was a loud, unpleasant bell, and made a very disagreeable sound. The other bells were inscribed according to the names of the rooms to which their wires were conducted, as picture room, double room, clock room, and the like. Following Master B's bell to its source, I found that young gentleman to have had but indifferent third-class accommodation in a triangular cabin under the cockloft, with a corner fireplace, which Master B must have been exceedingly small if he were ever able to warm himself at, and a corner chimney-piece like a pyramidal staircase to the ceiling for Tom Thumb. The papering of one side of the room had dropped down bodily, with fragments of plaster adhering to it, and almost blocked up the door. It appeared that Master B, in his spiritual condition, always made a point of pulling the paper down. Neither the landlord nor Ike could suggest why he made such a fool of himself. Except that the house had an immensely large, rambling loft at top, I made no other discoveries. It was moderately well furnished, but sparely. Some of the furniture, say a third, was as old as the house. The rest was of various periods within the last half-century. I was referred to a corn chandler in the marketplace of the county town to treat for the house. I went that day, and took it for 6 months. It was just the middle of October when I moved in with my maiden sister. I venture to call her 8 and 30. She is so very handsome, sensible, and engaging. We took with us a deaf stableman, my bloodhound Turk, 2 women servants, and a young person called an odd girl. I have reason to record of the attendant last enumerated, who was one of the St. Lawrence's Union female orphans, that she was a fatal mistake and a disastrous engagement. The year was dying early. The leaves were falling fast. It was a raw, cold day when we took possession, and the gloom of the house was most depressing. The cook, an amiable woman, but of a weak turn of intellect, burst into tears on beholding the kitchen, and requested that her silver watch might be delivered over to her sister, 2 Tuppintuck's Gardens, Liggs Walk, Clapham Rise, in the event of anything happening to her from the damp. Streaker, the housemaid, feigned cheerfulness, but was the greater martyr. The odd girl, who had never been in the country, alone was pleased, and made arrangements for sowing an acorn in the garden outside the scullery window, and rearing an oak. We went before dark through all the natural, as opposed to supernatural, miseries incidental to our state. Dispiriting reports ascended like the smoke from the basement in volumes, and descended from the upper rooms. There was no rolling pin, there was no salamander, which failed to surprise me, for I don't know what it is. There was nothing in the house. What there was broken. The last people must have lived like pigs. What could the meaning of the landlord be? Through these distresses, the odd girl was cheerful and exemplary. But within 4 hours after dark, we had got into a supernatural groove, and the odd girl had seen eyes, and was in hysterics. My sister and I had agreed to keep the haunting strictly to ourselves, and my impression was, and still is, that I had not left Ike when he helped to unload the cart, alone with the women, or any one of them, for 1 minute. Nevertheless, as I say, the odd girl had seen eyes. No other explanation could ever be drawn from her, before 9, and by 10 o'clock had had as much vinegar applied to her as would pickle a handsome salmon. I leave a discerning public to judge of my feelings when, under these untoward circumstances, at about 10:30 o'clock, Master B.'s bell began to ring in a most infuriated manner, and Turk howled until the house resounded with his lamentations. I hope I may never again be in a state of mind so unchristian as the mental frame in which I lived for some weeks, respecting the memory of Master B. Whether his bell was rung by rats, or mice, or bats, or wind, or what other accidental vibration, or sometimes by one cause, sometimes another, and sometimes by collusion, I don't know. But certain it is that it did ring 2 nights out of 3, until I conceived the happy idea of twisting Master B.'s neck. In other words, breaking his bell short off, and silencing that young gentleman, as to my experience and belief, forever. But by that time, the odd girl had developed such improving powers of catalepsy that she had become a shining example of that very inconvenient disorder. She would stiffen like a Guy Fawkes endowed with unreason on the most irrelevant occasions. I would address the servants in a lucid manner, pointing out to them that I had painted Master B.'s room and balked the paper, and taken Master B.'s bell away and balked the ringing. And if they could suppose that that confounded boy had lived and died to clothe himself with no better behavior than would most unquestionably have brought him and the sharpest particles of a birch broom into close acquaintance in the present imperfect state of existence, could they also suppose a mere poor human being, such as I was, capable by those contemptible means of counteracting and limiting the powers of the disembodied spirits of the dead, or of any spirits? I say I would become emphatic and cogent, not to say rather complacent, in such an address. when it would all go for nothing by reason of the odd girls suddenly stiffening from the toes upward and glaring among us like a parochial petrifaction. Streaker, the housemaid, too, had an attribute of a most discomforting nature. I am unable to say whether she was of an unusually lymphatic temperament, or what else was the matter with her, but this young woman became a mere distillery for the production of the largest and most transparent tears I ever met with. Combined with these characteristics was a peculiar tenacity of hold in those specimens, so that they didn't fall, but hung upon her face and nose. In this condition, and mildly and deplorably shaking her head, her silence would throw me more heavily than the admirable Crichton could have done in a verbal disputation for a purse of money. Cook, likewise, always covered me with confusion, as with a garment, by neatly winding up the session with the protest that the ooze was wearing her out, and by meekly repeating her last wishes regarding her silver watch. As to our nightly life, the contagion of suspicion and fear was among us, and there is no such contagion under the sky. Hooded woman? According to the accounts, we were in a perfect convent of hooded women. Noises? With that contagion downstairs, I myself have sat in the dismal parlor, listening, until I have heard so many and such strange noises that they would have chilled my blood if I had not warmed it by dashing out to make discoveries. Try this in bed in the dead of the night. Try this at your own comfortable fireside in the life of the night. You can fill any house with noises, if you will, until you have a noise for every nerve in your nervous system. I repeat, the contagion of suspicion and fear was among us, and there is no such contagion under the sky. The women, their noses in a chronic state of excoriation from smelling salts, were always primed and loaded for a swoon, and ready to go off with hair triggers. The two elder detached the odd girl on all expeditions that were considered doubly hazardous, and she always established the reputation of such adventures by coming back cataleptic. If Cook or Streaker went overhead after dark, we knew we should presently hear a bump on the ceiling, and this took place so constantly that it was as if a fighting man were engaged to go about the house, administering a touch of his art, which, I believe, is called the auctioneer, to every domestic he met with. It was in vain to do anything. It was in vain to be frightened for the moment in one's own person by a real owl, and then to show the owl. It was in vain to discover, by striking an accidental discord on the piano, that Turk always howled at particular notes and combinations. It was in vain to be a Rhadamanthus with the bells, and if an unfortunate bell rang without leave, to have it down inexorably and silence it. It was in vain to fire up chimneys, let torches down the well, charge furiously into suspected rooms and recesses. We changed servants, and it was no better. The new set ran away, and a third set came, and it was no better. At last, our comfortable housekeeping got to be so disorganized and wretched that I one night dejectedly said to my sister, "Patty, I begin to despair of our getting people to go on with us here, and I think we must give this up." My sister, who was a woman of immense spirit, replied, "No, John, don't give it up. Don't be beaten, John. There is another way." "And what is that?" said I. "John," returned my sister, "if we are not to be driven out of this house, and that for no reason whatever that is apparent to you or me, we must help ourselves and take the house wholly and solely into our own hands. "But the servants," said I. "Have no servants," said my sister boldly. Like most people in my grade of life, I had never thought of the possibility of going on without those faithful obstructions. The notion was so new to me when suggested that I looked very doubtful. "We know they come here to be frightened and infect one another, and we know they are frightened and do infect one another," said my sister. "With the exception of Bottles," I observed in a meditative tone. "The deaf stableman. I kept him in my service and still keep him, as a phenomenon of moroseness not to be matched in England." "To be sure, John," assented my sister. "Except Bottles. And what does that go to prove? Bottles talks to nobody and hears nobody unless he is absolutely roared at. And what alarm has Bottles ever given or taken? None." This was perfectly true, the individual in question having retired every night at 10 o'clock to his bed over the coach-house, with no other company than a pitchfork and a pail of water. That the pail of water would have been over me, and the pitchfork through me, if I had put myself without announcement in Bottles's way after that minute, I deposited in my own mind as a fact worth remembering. Neither had Bottles ever taken the least notice of any of our many uproars. An imperturbable and speechless man, he had sat at his supper, with Streaker present in a swoon, and the odd girl, Marble, and had only put another potato in his cheek, or profited by the general misery to help himself to beefsteak pie. "And so," continued my sister, "I exempt Bottles, and considering, John, that the house is too large and perhaps too lonely to be kept well in hand by Bottles, you, and me, I propose that we cast about among our friends for a certain selected number of the most reliable and willing, form a society here for 3 months, wait upon ourselves and one another, live cheerfully and socially, and see what happens." I was so charmed with my sister that I embraced her on the spot, and went into her plan with the greatest ardor. We were then in the 3rd week of November, but we took our measures so vigorously, and were so well seconded by the friends in whom we confided, that there was still a week of the month unexpired, when our party all came down together merrily, and mustered in the haunted house. I will mention, in this place, 2 small changes that I made while my sister and I were yet alone. It occurring to me as not improbable that Turk howled in the house at night, partly because he wanted to get out of it, I stationed him in his kennel outside, but unchained. And I seriously warned the village that any man who came in his way must not expect to leave him without a rip in his own throat. I then casually asked Ike if he were a judge of a gun. On his saying, "Yes, sir, I knows a good gun when I sees her," I begged the favor of his stepping up to the house and looking at mine. "She's a true one, sir," said Ike, after inspecting a double-barreled rifle that I bought in New York a few years ago. "No mistake about her, sir." "Ike," said I, "don't mention it. I have seen something in this house." "No, sir," he whispered, greedily opening his eyes. "Hooded lady, sir." "Don't be frightened," said I. "It was a figure rather like you." "Lord, sir." "Ike," said I, shaking hands with him warmly, I may say affectionately, "if there is any truth in these ghost stories, the greatest service I can do you is to fire at that figure, and I promise you, by heaven and earth, I will do it with this gun, if I see it again." The young man thanked me and took his leave with some little precipitation, after declining a glass of liquor. I imparted my secret to him because I had never quite forgotten his throwing his cap at the bell, because I had, on another occasion, noticed something very like a fur cap lying not far from the bell, one night when it had burst out ringing, and because I had remarked that we were at our ghostliest whenever he came up in the evening to comfort the servants. Let me do Ike no injustice. He was afraid of the house, and believed in its being haunted, and yet he would play false on the haunting side, so surely as he got an opportunity. The odd girl's case was exactly similar. She went about the house in a state of real terror, and yet lied monstrously and willfully, and invented many of the alarms she spread, and made many of the sounds we heard. I had had my eye on the two, and I know it. It is not necessary for me here to account for this preposterous state of mind. I content myself with remarking that it is familiarly known to every intelligent man who has had fair medical, legal, or other watchful experience, that it is as well established and as common a state of mind as any with which observers are acquainted, and that it is one of the first elements above all others rationally to be suspected in, and strictly looked for, and separated from, any question of this kind. To return to our party. The first thing we did when we were all assembled was to draw lots for bedrooms. That done, and every bedroom, and indeed the whole house, having been minutely examined by the whole body, we allotted the various household duties, as if we had been on a gypsy party, or a yachting party, or a hunting party, or were shipwrecked. I then recounted the floating rumors concerning the hooded lady, the owl, and Master B, with others, still more filmy, which had floated about during our occupation, relative to some ridiculous old ghost of the female gender, who went up and down, carrying the ghost of a round table, and also to an impalpable jackass, whom nobody was ever able to catch. Some of these ideas I really believe our people below had communicated to one another in some diseased way, without conveying them in words. We then gravely called one another to witness that we were not there to be deceived, or to deceive, which we considered pretty much the same thing, and that, with a serious sense of responsibility, we would be strictly true to one another, and would strictly follow out the truth. The understanding was established that anyone who heard unusual noises in the night, and who wished to trace them, should knock at my door. Lastly, that on 12th night, the last night of Holy Christmas, all our individual experiences since that then present hour of our coming together in the haunted house should be brought to light for the good of all, and that we would hold our peace on the subject till then, unless on some remarkable provocation to break silence. We were, in number and in character, as follows. First, to get my sister and myself out of the way, there were we two. In the drawing of lots, my sister drew her own room, and I drew Master B's. Next, there was our first cousin, John Herschel, so called after the great astronomer, than whom I suppose a better man at a telescope does not breathe. With him was his wife, a charming creature to whom he had been married in the previous spring. I thought it, under the circumstances, rather imprudent to bring her, because there is no knowing what even a false alarm may do at such a time. But I suppose he knew his own business best, and I must say that if she had been my wife, I never could have left her endearing and bright face behind. They drew the clock room. Alfred Starling, an uncommonly agreeable young fellow of 28, for whom I have the greatest liking, was in the double room, mine, usually, and designated by that name from having a dressing room within it with 2 large and cumbersome windows, which no wedges I was ever able to make would keep from shaking, in any weather, wind or no wind. Alfred is a young fellow who pretends to be fast, another word for loose, as I understand the term, but who is much too good and sensible for that nonsense, and who would have distinguished himself before now, if his father had not unfortunately left him a small independence of 200 a year, on the strength of which his only occupation in life has been to spend 6. I am in hopes, however, that his banker may break, or that he may enter into some speculation guaranteed to pay 20%, for I am convinced that if he could only be ruined, his fortune is made. Belinda Bates, bosom friend of my sister, and a most intellectual, amiable, and delightful girl, got the picture room. She has a fine genius for poetry, combined with real business earnestness, and goes in, to use an expression of Alfred's, for woman's mission, woman's rights, woman's wrongs, and everything that is woman's with a capital W, or is not and ought to be, or is and ought not to be. Most praiseworthy, my dear, and heaven prosper you. I whispered to her on the first night of my taking leave of her at the picture-room door. But don't overdo it. And in respect of the great necessity there is, my darling, for more employments being within the reach of women than our civilization has as yet assigned to her, don't fly at the unfortunate men, even those men who are at first sight in your way, as if they were the natural oppressors of your sex. For trust me, Belinda, they do sometimes spend their wages among wives and daughters, sisters, mothers, aunts and grandmothers, and the play is really not all Wolf and Red Riding Hood, but has other parts in it. However, I digress. Belinda, as I have mentioned, occupied the picture room. We had but 3 other chambers, the corner room, the cupboard room, and the garden room. My old friend Jack Governor slung his hammock, as he called it, in the corner room. I've always regarded Jack as the finest-looking sailor that ever sailed. He is grey now, but as handsome as he was a quarter of a century ago. Nay, handsomer. A portly, cheery, well-built figure of a broad-shouldered man, with a frank smile, a brilliant dark eye, and a rich, dark eyebrow. I remember those under darker hair, and they look all the better for their silver setting. He has been wherever his Union namesake flies, has Jack, and I have met old shipmates of his, away in the Mediterranean, and on the other side of the Atlantic, who have beamed and brightened at the casual mention of his name, and have cried, "You know Jack Governor? Then you know a prince of men." That he is, and so unmistakably a naval officer that if you were to meet him coming out of an Eskimo snow hut in sealskin, you would be vaguely persuaded he was in full naval uniform. Jack once had that bright, clear eye of his on my sister, but it fell out that he married another lady and took her to South America, where she died. This was a dozen years ago or more. He brought down with him to our haunted house a little cask of salt beef, for he is always convinced that all salt beef not of his own pickling is mere carrion, and invariably when he goes to London packs a piece in his portmanteau. He had also volunteered to bring with him one Nat Beaver, an old comrade of his, captain of a merchantman. Mr. Beaver, with a thick-set, wooden face and figure, and apparently as hard as a block all over, proved to be an intelligent man, with a world of watery experiences in him and great practical knowledge. At times, there was a curious nervousness about him, apparently the lingering result of some old illness, but it seldom lasted many minutes. He got the cupboard room and lay there next to Mr. Undery, my friend and solicitor, who came down in an amateur capacity to go through with it, as he said, and who plays whist better than the whole law list, from the red cover at the beginning to the red cover at the end. I never was happier in my life, and I believe it was the universal feeling among us. Jack Governor, always a man of wonderful resources, was chief cook, and made some of the best dishes I ever ate, including unapproachable curries. My sister was pastry cook and confectioner. Starling and I were cook's mate, turn and turnabout, and on special occasions the chief cook pressed Mr. Beaver. We had a great deal of outdoor sport and exercise, but nothing was neglected within, and there was no ill humor or misunderstanding among us, and our evenings were so delightful that we had at least one good reason for being reluctant to go to bed. We had a few night alarms in the beginning. On the first night I was knocked up by Jack with a most wonderful ship's lantern in his hand, like the gills of some monster of the deep, who informed me that he was going aloft to the main truck to have the weathercock down. It was a stormy night, and I remonstrated, but Jack called my attention to its making a sound like a cry of despair, and said somebody would be hailing a ghost presently if it wasn't done. So up to the top of the house, where I could hardly stand for the wind, we went, accompanied by Mr. Beaver. And there, Jack, lantern and all, with Mr. Beaver after him, swarmed up to the top of a cupola, some 24 feet above the chimneys, and stood upon nothing particular, coolly knocking the weathercock off, until they both got into such good spirits with the wind and the height that I thought they would never come down. Another night they turned out again and had a chimney cowl off. Another night they cut a sobbing and gulping water pipe away. Another night they found out something else. On several occasions they both, in the coolest manner, simultaneously dropped out of their respective bedroom windows, hand over hand by their counterpanes, to overhaul something mysterious in the garden. The engagement among us was faithfully kept, and nobody revealed anything. All we knew was, if anyone's room were haunted, no one looked the worse for it. Chapter 2. The Ghost in Master B's Room. When I established myself in the triangular garret which had gained so distinguished a reputation, my thoughts naturally turned to Master B. My speculations about him were uneasy and manifold. Whether his Christian name was Benjamin, bisextile from his having been born in leap year, Bartholomew or Bill, whether the initial letter belonged to his family name, and that was Baxter, Black, Brown, Barker, Buggins, Baker, or Bird, whether he was a foundling and had been baptized B, whether he was a lion-hearted boy, and B was short for Briton or for Bull, whether he could possibly have been kith and kin to an illustrious lady who brightened my own childhood, and had come of the blood of the brilliant Mother Bunch. With these profitless meditations, I tormented myself much. I also carried the mysterious letter into the appearance and pursuits of the deceased, wondering whether he dressed in blue, wore boots, he couldn't have been bald, was a boy of brains, liked books, was good at bowling, had any skill as a boxer, even in his buoyant boyhood, bathed from a bathing machine at Bognor, Bangor, Bournemouth, Brighton, or Broadstairs like a bounding billiard ball. So, from the first, I was haunted by the letter B. It was not long before I remarked that I never, by any hazard, had a dream of Master B, or of anything belonging to him. But the instant I awoke from sleep, at whatever hour of the night, my thoughts took him up, and roamed away, trying to attach his initial letter to something that would fit it, and keep it quiet. For 6 nights I'd been worried thus in Master B's room, when I began to perceive that things were going wrong. The first appearance that presented itself was early in the morning, when it was but just daylight and no more. I was standing shaving at my glass, when I suddenly discovered, to my consternation and amazement, that I was shaving not myself, I am 50, but a boy, apparently Master B. I trembled and looked over my shoulder. Nothing there. I looked again in the glass and distinctly saw the features and expression of a boy who was shaving, not to get rid of a beard, but to get one. Extremely troubled in my mind, I took a few turns in the room and went back to the looking-glass, resolved to steady my hand and complete the operation in which I'd been disturbed. Opening my eyes, which I had shut while recovering my firmness, I now met in the glass, looking straight at me, the eyes of a young man of 4 or 5 and 20. Terrified by this new ghost, I closed my eyes and made a strong effort to recover myself. Opening them again, I saw, shaving his cheek in the glass, my father, who has long been dead. Nay, I even saw my grandfather too, whom I never did see in my life. Although naturally much affected by these remarkable visitations, I determined to keep my secret until the time agreed upon for the present general disclosure. Agitated by a multitude of curious thoughts, I retired to my room that night, prepared to encounter some new experience of a spectral character. Nor was my preparation needless, for, waking from an uneasy sleep at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, what were my feelings to find that I was sharing my bed with the skeleton of Master B. I sprang up, and the skeleton sprang up also. I then heard a plaintive voice saying, "Where am I? What is become of me?" And, looking hard in that direction, perceived the ghost of Master B. The young spectre was dressed in an obsolete fashion, or rather was not so much dressed as put into a case of inferior pepper and salt cloth, made horrible by means of shining buttons. I observed that these buttons went in a double row over each shoulder of the young ghost, and appeared to descend his back. He wore a frill round his neck. His right hand, which I distinctly noticed to be inky, was laid upon his stomach. Connecting this action with some feeble pimples on his countenance and his general air of nausea, I concluded this ghost to be the ghost of a boy who had habitually taken a great deal too much medicine. "Where am I?" said the little spectre, in a pathetic voice. "And why was I born in the calomel days? And why did I have all that calomel given me?" I replied with sincere earnestness that upon my soul I couldn't tell him. "Where is my little sister?" said the ghost. "And where my angelic little wife? And where is the boy I went to school with?" I entreated the phantom to be comforted, and above all things to take heart respecting the loss of the boy he went to school with. I represented to him that probably that boy never did, within human experience, come out well when discovered. I urged that I myself had, in later life, turned up several boys whom I went to school with, and none of them had at all answered. I expressed my humbled belief that that boy never did answer. I represented that he was a mythic character, a delusion, and a snare. I recounted how, the last time I found him at a dinner party behind a wall of white cravat, with an inconclusive opinion on every possible subject, and a power of silent boredom absolutely titanic. I related how, on the strength of our having been together at old Doylance's, he had asked himself to breakfast with me, a social offence of the largest magnitude, how, fanning my weak embers of belief in Doylance's boys, I had let him in, and how he had proved to be a fearful wanderer about the earth, pursuing the race of Adam with inexplicable notions concerning the currency, and with a proposition that the Bank of England should, on pain of being abolished, instantly strike off and circulate God knows how many thousand millions of 10 and 6-penny notes. The ghost heard me in silence, and with a fixed stare. "Barber," it apostrophized me when I had finished. "Barber," I repeated, for I am not of that profession. "Condemned," said the ghost, "to shave a constant change of customers. Now me, now a young man, now thyself as thou art, now thy father, now thy grandfather. Condemned, too, to lie down with a skeleton every night, and to rise with it every morning." I shuddered on hearing this dismal announcement. "Barber, pursue me!" I had felt, even before the words were uttered, that I was under a spell to pursue the phantom. I immediately did so, and was in Master B's room no longer. Most people know what long and fatiguing night journeys had been forced upon the witches who used to confess, and who, no doubt, told the exact truth, particularly as they were always assisted with leading questions, and the torture was always ready. I asseverate that, during my occupation of Master B's room, I was taken by the ghost that haunted it on expeditions fully as long and wild as any of those. Assuredly, I was presented to no shabby old man with a goat's horns and tail, something between Pan and an old clothesman, holding conventional receptions, as stupid as those of real life and less decent. But I came upon other things, which appeared to me to have more meaning. Confident that I speak the truth and shall be believed, I declare without hesitation that I followed the ghost, in the first instance on a broomstick, and afterwards on a rocking horse. The very smell of the animal's paint, especially when I brought it out by making him warm, I am ready to swear to. I followed the ghost afterwards in a hackney coach, an institution with a peculiar smell of which the present generation is unacquainted, but to which I am again ready to swear as a combination of stable, dog with the mange, and very old bellows. In this, I appeal to previous generations to confirm or refute me. I pursued the phantom on a headless donkey, at least upon a donkey who was so interested in the state of his stomach that his head was always down there, investigating it. On ponies, expressly born to kick up behind. On roundabouts and swings from fairs. In the first cab, another forgotten institution, where the fare regularly got into bed and was tucked up with the driver. not to trouble you with a detailed account of all my travels in pursuit of the ghost of Master B, which were longer and more wonderful than those of Sinbad the Sailor, I will confine myself to one experience from which you may judge of many. I was marvelously changed. I was myself, yet not myself. I was conscious of something within me, which has been the same all through my life, and which I have always recognized under all its phases and varieties as never altering. And yet I was not the I who had gone to bed in Master B's room. I have the smoothest of faces and the shortest of legs, and I had taken another creature like myself, also with the smoothest of faces and the shortest of legs, behind a door, and was confiding to him a proposition of the most astounding nature. This proposition was that we should have a seraglio. The other creature assented warmly. He had no notion of respectability, neither had I. It was the custom of the East. It was the way of the good Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Let me have the corrupted name again for once, it is so scented with sweet memories. The usage was highly laudable and most worthy of imitation. "Oh yes, let us," said the other creature with a jump, "have a seraglio." It was not because we entertained the faintest doubts of the meritorious character of the Oriental establishment we proposed to import, that we perceived it must be kept a secret from Miss Griffin. It was because we knew Miss Griffin to be bereft of human sympathies and incapable of appreciating the greatness of the great Haroun. Mystery impenetrably shrouded from Miss Griffin, then, let us entrust it to Miss Buell. We were 10 in Miss Griffin's establishment by Hampstead Ponds, 8 ladies and 2 gentlemen. Miss Buell, whom I judged to have attained the ripe age of 8 or 9, took the lead in society. I opened the subject to her in the course of the day, and proposed that she should become the favorite. Miss Buell, after struggling with the diffidence so natural to and charming in her adorable sex, expressed herself as flattered by the idea, but wished to know how it was proposed to provide for Miss Pipson. Miss Buell, who was understood to have vowed towards that young lady a friendship, halves, and no secrets until death, on the church service and lessons complete in 2 volumes with case and lock. Miss Buell said she could not, as the friend of Miss Pipson, disguise from herself or me that Pipson was not one of the common. Now, Miss Pipson, having curly hair and blue eyes, which was my idea of anything mortal and feminine that was called fair, I promptly replied that I regarded Miss Pipson in the light of a fair Circassian. "And what then?" Miss Buell pensively asked. I replied that she must be unveiled by a merchant, brought to me veiled, and purchased as a slave. The other creature had already fallen into the second male place in the state, and was set apart for Grand Vizier. He afterwards resisted this disposal of events, but had his hair pulled until he yielded. "Shall I not be jealous?" Miss Buell inquired, casting down her eyes. "Zobeida, no," I replied. "You will ever be the favorite sultana. The first place in my heart and on my throne will ever be yours." Miss Buell, upon that assurance, consented to propound the idea to her 7 beautiful companions, it occurring to me in the course of the same day that we knew we could trust a grinning and good-natured soul called Tabby, who was the serving drudge of the house, and had no more figure than one of the beds. I slipped into Miss Buell's hand after supper, a little note to that effect, pointing Tabby out for Mesrur, the celebrated chief of the harem. There were difficulties in the formation of the desired institution, as there are in all combinations. The other creature showed himself of a low character, and when defeated in aspiring to the throne, pretended to have conscientious scruples about prostrating himself before the caliph. Wouldn't call him commander of the faithful, spoke of him slightingly and inconsistently as a mere chap. Said he, the other creature, wouldn't play, and was otherwise coarse and offensive. The meanness of disposition was, however, put down by the general indignation of a united seraglio, and I became blessed in the smiles of 8 of the fairest of the daughters of men. The smiles could only be bestowed when Miss Griffin was looking another way, and only then in a very wary manner, for there was a legend among the followers of the Prophet that she saw with a little round ornament in the middle of the pattern on the back of her shawl. But every day after dinner for an hour we were all together, and then the favorite and the rest of the royal harem competed who should most beguile the leisure of the serene Haroun reposing from the cares of state, which were generally, as in most affairs of state, of an arithmetical character, the commander of the faithful being a fearful boggler at a sum. On these occasions the devoted Mesrur was always in attendance, Miss Griffin usually ringing for that officer at the same time with great vehemence, but never acquitted himself in a manner worthy of his historical reputation. In the first place, his bringing a broom into the divan of the caliph, even when Haroun wore on his shoulders the red robe of anger, Miss Pipson's pelisse, though it might be got over for the moment, was never to be quite satisfactorily accounted for. In the second place, his breaking out into grinning exclamations of, "Lawk, you pretties," was neither Eastern nor respectful. In the third place, when specially instructed to say Bismillah, he always said Alleluia. This officer, unlike his class, was too good-humoured altogether, kept his mouth open far too wide, expressed approbation to an incongruous extent, and even once, it was on the occasion of the purchase of the fair Circassian of 500,000 purses of gold, and cheap too, embraced the slave, the favourite, and the caliph all round. Parenthetically, let me say, God bless Mesrur, and may there have been sons and daughters on that tender bosom, softening many a hard day since. Miss Griffin was a model of propriety, and I am at a loss to imagine what the feelings of the virtuous woman would have been if she had known, as she paraded us down the Hampstead Road 2 and 2, that she was walking with a stately step at the head of polygamy and Mohammedanism. I believe that a mysterious and terrible joy with which the contemplation of Miss Griffin in this unconscious state inspired us, and a grim sense prevalent among us that there was a dreadful power in our knowledge of what Miss Griffin, who knew all things that could be learnt out of a book, didn't know, were the mainspring of the preservation of our secret. It was wonderfully kept, but was once upon the verge of self-betrayal. The danger and escape occurred upon a Sunday. We were all 10 ranged in a conspicuous part of the gallery at church, with Miss Griffin at our head, as we were every Sunday, advertising the establishment in an unsecular sort of way, when the description of Solomon in his domestic glory happened to be read. The moment that monarch was thus referred to, conscience whispered me, "Thou too, Haroun." The officiating minister had a cast in his eye, and it assisted conscience by giving him the appearance of reading personally at me. A crimson blush, attended by a fearful perspiration, suffused my features. The Grand Vizier became more dead than alive, and the whole seraglio reddened, as if the sunset of Baghdad shone direct upon their lovely faces. At this portentous time, the awful Griffin rose, and balefully surveyed the children of Islam. My own impression was that Church and State had entered into a conspiracy with Miss Griffin to expose us, and that we should all be put into white sheets and exhibited in the center aisle. But so westerly, if I may be allowed the expression, as opposite to Eastern associations, was Miss Griffin's sense of rectitude, that she merely suspected apples, and we were saved. I have called the seraglio united, upon the question solely whether the commander of the faithful does exercise a right of kissing in that sanctuary of the palace where its peerless inmates divided. Zobeida asserted a counter-right in the favorite to scratch, and the fair Circassian put her face for refuge into a green baize bag, originally designed for books. On the other hand, a young antelope of transcendent beauty from the fruitful plains of Camden Town, whence she had been brought by traders in the half-yearly caravan that crossed the intermediate desert after the holidays, held more liberal opinions, but stipulated for limiting the benefit of them to that dog, and son of a dog, the Grand Vizier, who had no rights and was not in question. At length, the difficulty was compromised by the installation of a very youthful slave as deputy. She, raised upon a stool, officially received upon her cheeks the salutes intended by the gracious Haroun for other sultanas, and was privately rewarded from the coffers of the ladies of the harem. And now it was, at the full height of enjoyment of my bliss, that I became heavily troubled. I began to think of my mother, and what she would say to my taking home at midsummer 8 of the most beautiful of the daughters of men, but all unexpected. I thought of the number of beds we made up at our house, of my father's income, and of the baker, and my despondency redoubled. The seraglio and malicious vizier, divining the cause of their lord's unhappiness, did their utmost to augment it. They professed unbounded fidelity, and declared that they would live and die with him. Reduced to the utmost wretchedness by these protestations of attachment, I lay awake for hours at a time, ruminating on my frightful lot. In my despair, I think I might have taken an early opportunity of falling on my knees before Miss Griffin, avowing my resemblance to Solomon, and praying to be dealt with according to the outraged laws of my country, if an unthought-of means of escape had not opened before me. One day we were out walking, 2 and 2, on which occasion the vizier had his usual instructions to take note of the boy at the turnpike, and if he profanely gazed, which he always did, at the beauties of the harem, to have him bowstrung in the course of the night. And it happened that our hearts were veiled in gloom. An unaccountable action on the part of the antelope had plunged the state into disgrace. That charmer, on the representation that the previous day was her birthday, and that vast treasures had been sent in a hamper for its celebration, both baseless assertions, had secretly but most pressingly invited 35 neighboring princes and princesses to a ball and supper, with a special stipulation that they were not to be fetched till 12. This wandering of the antelope's fancy led to the surprising arrival at Miss Griffin's door, in divers equipages and under various escorts, of a great company in full dress, who were deposited on the top step in a flush of high expectancy, and who were dismissed in tears. At the beginning of the double knocks attendant on these ceremonies, the antelope had retired to a back attic and bolted herself in, and at every new arrival Miss Griffin had gone so much more and more distracted that at last she had been seen to tear her front. Ultimate capitulation on the part of the offender had been followed by solitude in the linen closet, bread and water, and a lecture to all, of vindictive length, in which Miss Griffin had used expressions: firstly, "I believe you all knew of it." Secondly, "Every one of you is as wicked as another." Thirdly, "A pack of little wretches." Under these circumstances, we were walking drearily along, and I especially, with my responsibilities heavy on me, was in a very low state of mind, when a strange man accosted Miss Griffin, and after walking on at her side for a little while, and talking with her, looked at me. Supposing him to be a minion of the law, and that my hour was come, I instantly ran away, with the general purpose of making for Egypt. The whole seraglio cried out when they saw me making off as fast as my legs would carry me. I had an impression that the first turning on the left and round by the public house would be the shortest way to the pyramids. Miss Griffin screamed after me, the faithless vizier ran after me, and the boy at the turnpike dodged me into a corner like a sheep and cut me off. Nobody scolded me when I was taken and brought back. Miss Griffin only said, with a stunning gentleness, this was very curious. Why had I run away when the gentleman looked at me? If I had had any breath to answer with, I dare say I should have made no answer. Having no breath, I certainly made none. Miss Griffin and the strange man took me between them, and walked me back to the palace in a sort of state, but not at all, as I couldn't help feeling with astonishment, in culprit state. When we got there, we went into a room by ourselves, and Miss Griffin called in to her assistance Mesrour, chief of the guards of the harem. Mesrour, on being whispered to, began to shed tears. "Bless you, my precious," said that officer, turning to me. "Your pa's took bitter bad." I asked with a fluttered heart, "Is he very ill?" "Lord temper the wind to you, my lamb," said the good Mesrour, kneeling down, that I might have a comforting shoulder for my head to rest on. "Your pa's dead." Haroun al-Rashid took to flight at the words. The seraglio vanished. From that moment, I never again saw one of the 8 of the fairest of the daughters of men. I was taken home, and there was debt at home, as well as death, and we had a sale there. My own little bed was so superciliously looked upon by a power unknown to me, hazily called the trade, that a brass coal scuttle, a roasting jack, and a bird cage were obliged to be put into it to make a lot of it, and then it went for a song. So I heard mentioned, and I wondered what song, and thought what a dismal song it must have been to sing. Then I was sent to a great, cold, bare school of big boys, where everything to eat and wear was thick and clumpy, without being enough, where everybody, large and small, was cruel, where the boys knew all about the sale before I got there, and asked me what I had fetched, and who had bought me, and hooted at me. Going, going, gone. I never whispered in that wretched place that I had been Haroun, or had had a seraglio, for I knew that if I mentioned my reverses, I should be so worried that I should have to drown myself in the muddy pond near the playground, which looked like the beer. Ah me! Ah me! No other ghost has haunted the boys' room, my friends, since I have occupied it, than the ghost of my own childhood, the ghost of my own innocence, the ghost of my own airy belief. Many a time have I pursued the phantom, never with this man's stride of mine to come up with it, never with these man's hands of mine to touch it, never more to this man's heart of mine to hold it in its purity. And here you see me working out, as cheerfully and thankfully as I may, my doom of shaving in the glass a constant change of customers, and of lying down and rising up with the skeleton allotted to me for my mortal companion. Thank you for listening to The Haunted House by Charles Dickens. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider subscribing and leaving a like to help in the making of future audiobooks.